You guys already are familiar with today's world. With one click, you could visit anywhere, and you can find anything and buy it. You can very easily access your bank account. You could communicate with your friends easily. But imagine we wake up one morning and the computer has not been invented yet. A tool that really made our life a whole lot easier is no longer here. Computers pretty much entered every category of our lives. And without them, life will be a lot harder and more boring. So, this thing that's really important and makes our lives a whole lot easier, where did it come from? How did it start? Please stay with us and let's see the history of the computer. You guys know today's computers. This is a laptop, this is a desktop, and you could say this iPad and cell phone are a computer as well. But back in the day, the name computer didn't mean any of this. The first time the term computer was ever used, it was in the year 1613. It was in an English book called The Young Man's Gleanings. In this book, a person that could solve complicated calculations was called a computer. And after that, this word literally meant that, a person that could solve complicated equations. If that's the case, an abacus is a form of computer as well, because it can calculate. And we could say an abacus is probably the first computer ever made. The invention of the abacus started in Mesopotamia, and if you don't know where that is, it's the two main rivers in the Middle East. After its invention, the abacus was used in pretty much every civilization known to man, like the Egyptians, Persians, Chinese, Indians, all of them. And you could kind of say that the abacus is the longest lasting computer that didn't get an update. It wasn't like today's computer, which every week you get a new update. This computer grew in the 19th and 20th century, and different calculators were invented. But computers really took a turn when they were able to be programmed. Basically, it would help out the human in return. It wasn't like a calculator that you have to do an input to get an output. A modern computer takes one input and does multiple things with it. Charles Babbage in the year 1822 invented the first mechanical computer, and it was programmable. But Charles Babbage was unlucky because he needed a budget, and the British government would not give it to him. And that is why one was only built and it didn't really get far. After that, they kind of forgot about computers. But in the beginning of the 20th century, this idea came alive again, and analog computers were invented, and it could solve complicated calculations. Vannevar Bush in the year 1920 invented the first analog computer in MIT. After that, until World War II, different countries would compete with each other to see who can create the best computer. Advanced countries really wanted to make the best computer out of everyone else, and this caused the computer to really take a turn. And the first advanced computer, and we could say it's the grandfather of all computers, was invented by Alan Turing. Alan Turing's invention was very useful to the British Army, and that helped them defeat the Germans, because the British could use this computer to crack the Enigma code the Nazis were using. Basically, they could spy on whatever the Germans were telling each other, and they would realize what their operation was. But Alan Turing died, and this invention didn't get farther. But in the year 1944, the first digital computer was invented by Howard Aiken. This was the first computer that was programmed with the numbers 1 and 0, something we still see to this day. After this, vacuum computers by John Moltke and J. Prescott Aker were invented, and it was faster than the computers before that. This was a computer that was completely electrical. Even though the vacuum computer was very fast, but it had its own problems. The problems was that it would make mistakes and it was giant and very heavy. In 1947, in the Bell Laboratory, they realized they could use electrical conductors to amplify electricity, and this caused them to go towards a transistor. They invented the transistor to replace these giant vacuums or these lamp vacuums that we know of. Less space, lighter, faster, and less mistakes. William Shockley was the inventor of the transistor, and he wanted to make it better. To start his business, he moved to Palo Alto, California, and he started his company there. And it's cool to know that this was the first technology company that started in Silicon Valley. In the 1950s, the board was invented. And with the invention of the board, building computers got a whole lot easier and the parts became cheaper. This invention really helped with creating the modern computer because these boards got smaller and smaller and faster. In 1968, the first microprocessor was invented. Basically, all that processing in a tiny chip. Smaller and smaller continued until we got to 1974, and that's when Intel made the 8080 processor. This processor allowed regular people to buy parts and build computers. One of the people that would buy these parts and build computers was Steve Wozniak. If you don't know him, let me introduce him to you. He's the partner of Steve Jobs in starting Apple. So these two are the founders of Apple. Since Steve Wozniak would buy these parts and build computers, he thought of an idea, and that's to start a company, build these high quality computers, put our own badge and sell it to the public. He and Steve Jobs got to work. We could say one of the first computers that entered regular people's homes and they could work with it easily without being overly complicated. It was built by Apple. In the 1980s, a new competitor joined the market, and that's IBM. And the IBM was also using the 8080 processor. The computers back then had a huge problem, and the problem was that each computer had a different operating system and had to be programmed differently. And that's when Gary Kildall created the first operating system, so each computer could download it and all of them could use one program. After this, IBM really wanted to buy this operating system from Gary Kildall. But Gary Kildall said it's not for sale because we found a young fella that we're interested in working with. Who was that young person? Bill Gates, and he was the founder of Microsoft. And you guys already know how he started and where he is at now. This idea really started the Microsoft company and turned it to the biggest computer companies in the world. But Steve Jobs didn't want this operating system. He wanted something that's simple that a normal person could use, and it's not complicated like the Windows system. And eventually, Jobs figures it out, and in the year 1984, he releases the Macintosh. A computer that has a mouse, a keyboard, and a literal desktop that you could use your mouse and move it around. A few years later, Microsoft basically copies this idea, and because of copyright, Apple decides to sue them. Even though it was basically a copy of Steve Jobs' idea, the court was in the favor of Microsoft, and Apple didn't win. After the 1980s, the idea of the computer basically hasn't changed yet. It's the same system, but a lot more advanced, a lot faster, a lot smarter, a lot lighter, smaller, and cheaper. Computers have really taken over the world. Anything you can think of is controlled by a computer. Any work you need done, a computer has to be involved. But is the computer not gonna get any different from that 1980s model? What's gonna replace these computers? This replacement has been set: quantum computers. And we've made a video about it if you'd like to see.